Hello, and welcome to another episode of Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. We get to do a lot of all of that today, so it's kind of fun. In October of 2021, I had the honor and pleasure to interview, well, let me rephrase that, talk with Peggy Chong, known as the Blind History Lady. Maybe it was a little bit more of an interview then, but we have really reshaped Unstoppable Mindset to be a conversation and not an interview. So it does get to be something where we get to talk with each other and ask each other questions and whatever else makes sense to do. Well, Peggy wrote a story about a blind lady, and the story was published recently. And she did what she always does. She sends it to anyone on her mailing list. And I'm fortunate enough to be on it and read it. And I suddenly realized it has been 2.5 years since we had Peggy on, and that has to change. So, Peggy, welcome onto Unstoppable Mindset.
Welcome to me. Yes, I was really surprised that it had been 2.5 years. So thanks for having me back.
Well, anytime. So, Peggy is known as the Blind History Lady because she specifically researches information about blind people, and she really researches their lives and then tells people about them. And we'll dig into a lot of that. But why don't we start? Maybe it'll be a little bit of redoing of what we did. Tell us about the early Peggy growing up.
Well, I grew up in a family where my mother was blind, and I have three blind siblings out of a family of five kids. So there's four of us. And my mother had gone to the North Dakota School for the Blind. So she was not eager to send her children to the School for the Blind at all.
Mm.
She wanted us to go to public school.
How
So
come?
we, well, she did not like the idea of being so far away from her family. She felt that
Ah.
it really, there were some family dynamics that uh, go into that as well. But
Mhm.
basically, she went up there in the end of August, early September. Many times came home for Christmas, but not always. And then she went home the end of May. So
Mm.
she was really only with her family mostly in the summers.
I remember when I was growing up, and we moved to California from Chicago, and my parents had really heated arguments with the school district in Palmdale because they said I shouldn't go to school there. I should go to the School for the Blind, which at that point was in, well, and still is in Northern California. It hadn't relocated to Fremont, I don't think yet, but they wanted me to go there. And my parents said, no, he's going to grow up and go to regular public schools. And it was a huge battle. Well, my parents won, but I suspect it was for probably a lot of the same reasons why your mom didn't want you guys to go.
Well, my mom came from a town of 400 people. So the public school there, first of all, if she had gone to public school, most kids didn't get past the eighth grade. They went to work on the farms.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she would have not been able to get a lot of material in any kind of a format at all. Her
Mm-hmm.
ophthalmologist, when she was 6 years old, wrote in her record that she needed to go to the School for the Blind and to learn to read and write in Braille, which I thought was amazing
Yeah.
for a doctor to say that at that time.
Yeah. The doctors told my parents to send me off to a home because no blind child could ever grow up to amount to anything or be useful at all. And all I would do would be to destroy the family dynamic. And but the other side of it is, as we know, you and I, places like the School for the Blind in California really did teach a lot. They were at that time, I think Newell Perry was still there. Um, Tembrick had been one of his students, and they did teach a lot of the right stuff, along with providing the right material. But still, it was a question of whether that's where you really wanted to be sent to or have your child sent to.
One of the interesting things that has changed a lot of my thinking doing this whole history um, dive that I have been doing. when I graduated from public school, I didn't really feel like a part of my class,
Hmm.
but I thought I had gotten a better education. And at that time, the schools for the blind were changing. More kids were getting into the public schools who were more academic, and the schools for the blind were receiving more of the students who were not academic. So the kids that were graduating from the school for the blind about the same time I were not always, um, job ready. They weren't going to do much afterwards. And so my impression at that time was that that's what happens when you go to
Hmm.
the school for the blind, not understanding the dynamics that the whole education system was going through and so on. But I look back at some of these people that I've researched, and they talk about how in the farming communities, which many of them came from because our communities were fairly small, they went to the school for the blind and they fit in.
Hmm.
Um, they had peers at their level. Everything was in enough format they could read mostly, or the accommodations were being made for them. They competed in sports. They got involved in some of the community activities in the towns where the schools for the blind were, so that they were connected with the community. And they seem to have, not all of them, of course, you don't always want to tar everybody with the same brush, so to speak, but you don't um, you see more of a population of kids who had more self-confidence, who had more of an idea of what they were going to do as a blind person after leaving the school,
Hmm.
as opposed to the public school kids who were exposed to a lot of things, but if they didn't get in with the group, if they didn't get a chance to really participate, if they were just sitting on the sidelines, they left the public school system and they didn't go to college necessarily. They didn't go to work. They went back to the family home. So when I graduated from high school, I thought a public school education was the best thing for a blind child.
At that
I'm
time.
not at that time, but I'm not so sure that that's really the case. I think you have to look at the child, the family situation, the school situation. Is the
But I,
public school going to provide a good, positive, supportive learning structure? And
of
that doesn't
course,
always happen.
of course, yeah, it still doesn't always happen. Although, of course, there is a lot more material and there are a lot of tools available now that even when you and I graduated were not available. And students should be able to get a better public education. But the other part about it is the whole social acceptance. And like you, I think I was really mostly on the sidelines. I was active in the science club and a couple things, but really not involved in a lot of the social organization of the schools. And that went all the way through high school. But I did at least have access to Braille books and Braille material. And I had parents who were vehemently in favor of me working to be a good student in the school. And they gave me every opportunity that I could. And outside of school, I was in the Boy Scouts. And so I did have other activities. And again, that was encouraged. And I was very fortunate for the most part. We dealt with scout leaders who encouraged it as well, probably because they had conversations from my parents or with my parents who said, look, and gave them an education. So, but it worked out pretty well. And my dad was involved in scouting as well. But I hear what you're saying. And I think that the schools for the blind, as near as I can tell today, have receded even further and are not really as much focused on the academics of students who are blind, but now they're dealing with multi-handicap situations and other things that make it even more of a challenge for them.
Yeah, but I do think that you're right. Parents make a big difference. Family support makes a huge difference.
Yes. Yeah. And the parents really do make all the difference. If they're willing to as I describe it, be risk takers in that they let us explore, they let us do things. I'm sure they monitor us, but they
Hmm.
allowed us to explore. They allowed us to learn about the world. And they knew instinctively that's what they needed to do, just like they would do it with any other kid.
Yeah, my parents let us ride bicycles,
Yep.
which I know that my mother, she did not feel confident enough to ride a bicycle, but us kids wanted to, and she was gonna just let it happen. And we had a few bike accidents, but
Well, yeah, so does
so did
everybody.
my sighted sister.
Yeah, I mean everybody does. So there's nothing new there. And eventually we bought a tandem bike so my brother and I could deliver newspapers together. And that worked out pretty well. But I had my own bike and rode it around the neighborhood, rode it to school for the first 3 years, and then transferred to a school across town because um, there was a resource teacher at who was based at that school, and the resource teacher was the teacher who would work with the blind kids. So I had a period with her every day, and I learned Braille in kindergarten in Chicago, but after Chicago, I didn't have access to it for 3 years, so I had to relearn it, which I did.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
things happen.
Yeah, they do.
So what'd you do after high school?
Well, after high school, I met this guy and got married. I thought about going to college, but I wasn't quite ready for college. I didn't really think that I was academically ready. So I went to work and worked as a librarian assistant for 2 years. And then when our daughter came along, then I quit, became a stay-at-home mom, and got active in the National Federation of the Blind. I got active in Tiny Tots, because my daughter went to Tiny Tots.
Ah.
And us moms sat around and exchanged coupons and everything like that while they were in there.
Did you exchange your share of coupons?
Oh, yeah, I traded all
Good.
my dog food coupons for the things that I needed, like milk or diapers or whatever.
And we should say that this guy you got married to, I'm sorry you have to put up with him all these years, but his name is Curtis Chong, and Curtis has also appeared on Unstoppable Mindset. But we probably have to get him back on too because there's lots to discuss.
Yeah, we were just discussing actually riding bikes when he was a kid because his father let him explore and get hurt. His mother was not inclined to do that. And so his dad took a lot of heat because Curtis would ride around on his three-wheeler and crash into the wall or roll out in the street or whatever, but he never
Curtis
got
has to learn
hurt.
to listen.
I don't think that's going to happen.
He's not nearby, is he?
Oh no.
Darn.
He'll catch it on the podcast.
Oh, he will. But still, but even so, he did get to explore, which is,
Yes,
what's really important. And I think that the blind people who have the most confidence or who are the most outgoing are the ones who were really given those opportunities by their parents.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. So you didn't go to college, you did other things, which is cool, and exchanged coupons. I've never been much of a coupon collector, and even with online coupons, I don't do nearly as much of that as I probably should.
Well, I don't do that anymore either.
But
But I did
Instacart
go
is
back
our
to,
friend.
yeah, that's true. I did go back to college for a while, and it actually was a really big boost in my self-esteem because I
Mm.
went back to college thinking I've got to start over, got to start from scratch. And so I took the basic courses that you take when you're a freshman, and I aced them, and I was quite surprised at myself. So it gave me a lot more confidence in myself to go ahead and try new things. I got out more into the community, joined the neighborhood group. I wrote letters, wrote articles for newsletters, and um, you know, really start to come into myself. probably when my daughter was about 10.
And she's surprised how much you've learned over the years, right?
Well, I was pretty dumb there for about between her 18th and 21st year, but I got pretty smart after that.
See,
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah. And since she's 45 now, I've been smart for a while.
What a relief.
No kidding. I feel very lucky when I look at the relationships that I read about in all these families that I research and the dynamics of the families and how kids don't get along and they never spoke to their parents after they were 22 or whatever. And I think, gee, I got my fighting with my daughter all done by the time she was 21. Now we're friends. So that's good.
Yeah, which works out.
Hmm.
So, when did you start getting interested in this whole business of researching blind ancestors and learning about the history of blind people?
Well, that actually started in my 20s. The NFB of Minnesota owned a home for the blind, and we decided that it was past its time. We did not need segregated housing for blind people. So we were going to sell the property. That meant you had to clean out the building, and there was a lot of stuff in there. And they had kept the National Federation of the Blind of Minnesota started as the Minnesota State Organization of the Blind and in 1920. So they had some correspondence going back to 1919 and they kept everything. I mean, it was really cool. I was given the job of going through all of the boxes and file cabinets and getting rid of stuff because we were going from this 3-story building to 1,000 square feet office
Ooh.
and has to all fit. So everything had to go into one file cabinet. And they gave me the job because I had grown up in the blind community. And as a kid, I had known the people from North Dakota and Minnesota who were the blind newspaper dealers, the blind rug weavers, the blind door to door salesmen, the blind janitors. And they thought I would recognize people more than the rest of them would. So I'm going through stuff and pitching and pitching and pitching all this stuff into the trash. Every so often I stop to read something. And one of the letters that I read was from the early 20s from one of the board members to another one describing their meeting with our blind state congressman, our blind U.S. congressman, excuse me. And of course, they don't tell who it is. I didn't know there was a blind congressman. So I put that aside and I started to pay more and more attention. So that blind congressman became my first, what I call ancestor. Um, I kept information that I had found here and there, kept those letters and put them in a box. And I went after what turned out to be Thomas David Shaw, who was the blind congressman who was working on a bill called the Robbins Bill that would have been kind of a rehabilitation bill, putting some things together that would be similar to what our Randolph Shepherd vendor program is today. That bill didn't go anywhere. Um, but he then became a U.S. Senator, and he was one of two blind senators in the U.S. Senate in the 1930s, the other being Thomas Pryor Gore. Thomas Shaw was killed by a hit and run driver just before Christmas of 1935. And he's a great ancestor to start with because he had all this mystery around him and you just had to know. So the driver of the car got out after he'd driven about a half a block and yelled back, well, he shouldn't have been in the street anyway. Now, he was with his sighted aide, one of his legislative aides, who was also hit and seriously hurt, but did survive. That aide wrote a book about 20 some years later, as did the daughter of a newspaperman from Minneapolis who was killed in the very same way 2 weeks before Shaw was killed. And that newspaper reporter moved into this apartment a couple of weeks before he was hit by a car out of Thomas Shaw's house in Minneapolis because he was being harassed for the article he was working on about the mafia infiltrating the Democratic Party. And Shaw was helping him with this article. And so Shaw's family believed, as did the daughter who wrote the book about her dad, the reporter, as did the person who was with him that day. They all said that, it was he was deliberately hit.
A
The
family
man who
hit.
hit him, yeah, he was deliberately hit because it if you talk to his grandson or his daughter-in-law, that they believe it was a contract hit.
Yeah.
But the man who hit him, who was unemployed, this was the middle of the Depression. He was unemployed, and all of a sudden, a couple of years later, he has a brand new house that's paid for. He has no job. His children are in private school. They go on to college. He has no job. Where'd the money come from?
Hmm.
Everybody wanted to know. Anyway, so he was somebody who I researched a lot, and that's before computers, and that was before you had an opportunity to go online and before things were digitized. So you had to always go someplace and have somebody look it up for you. And a lot of times I would call and I would say, well, can you read it to me over the phone?
Yeah,
I didn't tell them I couldn't read it myself. I just asked them to read it. I was surprised how many times people did read it,
that's
read
great.
articles to me, read the collection information to me, and so on. So he was my first ancestor, and because he was probably somebody I researched for good 30 years, um, I kind of got that in my blood. And then in about 2000, I decided I was going to do my family tree. Ancestry.com had just gotten started, and I thought, well, why not? Keeps me busy for the winter. It is worse addiction than chocolate or Coke. I am here to tell you. Mm-mm-mm. I have been a subscriber of Ancestry.com for a long time, and by and large, things are fairly accessible with that, unless you want to read the original document,
Hmm.
because things were mostly handwritten, and these are scanned images, pictures of the originals, and so on. But I'm surprised how many people are transcribing for their family trees the information, the articles, the pieces from the books. So sometimes I get into things and it's already transcribed for me. I'm really kind of impressed.
That works out very well.
I think so. So I was one who didn't like history in school because it didn't apply to me. And the few things that I had saved from Minnesota, that applied to me because that was an organization I belonged to and some of the people I had known. So I started with some of them because it applied to me. Um, but once I really got into the family history, I- it I just really got the bug. And when I would stall out on my family, I'd reach into now this collection that was more than a box or two of stuff that I had been collecting and say, well, I wonder what I can find about this person. Wonder what I can find about that person. And I took all these classes on how to research through the genealogical societies, several of them. And because it was when computers were not really used for genealogical research, they gave me a lot of information on the techniques that they use so they don't have to travel. And I used all of those techniques, and a lot of them are very great techniques that a blind person can use because for a $15 donation to this genealogical society or this history society or this public library, there's some volunteer that's just willing to dig into something and find out uh, what it is I want to know. And then they'll send me a nice email back or bunch of papers in the mail that I'll have to scan. But um, it's been really interesting to find out how easy it has been to dig into a lot of these old documents with the help of other people who have no idea that I'm blind at all.
Mm-hmm. Which which is of course part of the issue. They don't even know you're blind.
No, they have no clue. But
That's
they would do
okay.
that for someone else, you
Yeah.
know. So, yeah, I just take advantage of the opportunities that are already there and maximize them to my benefit.
So what are some of the early stories that you found that really fascinated you and that you found interesting that you've published?
Well, the one that just came out this month about Helen Mae Martin, the blind and deaf woman who was a concert pianist, is a fascinating story to me. And here's another example of this is a blind and deaf person who was born in 1895. The schools for the blind didn't take a blind and deaf student, and the schools for the deaf didn't take a deaf and blind student in many parts of the country. To get in as a deaf blind student, you either had to have a lot of money or there just happened to be somebody who was donating extra money at the time. You just happened to have a teacher that was skilled in working with one-on-one with a deaf-blind student. So Helen Mae didn't have that. She was born in Nebraska. The Nebraska School for the Blind and Deaf didn't want her. The Kansas School for the Blind and Deaf didn't want her. The Missouri School for the Blind and the School for the Deaf didn't want her. So her mother decided Helen is going to grow up and she is going to be the best of whatever she can be.
There's
Her
mom
mo-
again. There's the
yep.
family again.
Well, mom was a music teacher. Dad was a salesman who was on the road a lot, but he was also musically inclined, and they had a piano in the house. Mom taught music, and she kept Helen with her a lot. And Helen thought this was a game on the piano, the keys and doing it. So she wanted to learn the game too. Mom had her put her hand on the piano to feel the vibrations. Later on, it was the heel of her foot to feel the vibrations and how she would press the key harder, and the vibrations of the piano were more full. When Helen started to really learn how to play the pieces, her mother would teach her with one hand, then the other, and they would put it together. And then her mother started to explain musical notes by using beans. A whole note was one bean, a half a note was two beans, quarter note was four beans, and explained how that worked to Helen. Then they would play these pieces, and the mother would say, well, this is a song about the flowers, or this is a song about someone's life. And so Helen needed to know the story. And then the music had feeling, her emotions. She understood the music better, and she learned to play with feeling as well. And when she was about 18, she wrote to the schools for the blind, asking again to have somebody come and teach her. Now, her mother was a smart woman. She knew there were magazines for the blind, and so she wrote and got everything she could find. Well, some were in New York Point, some were in
Mm-hmm.
Braille.
Moon type and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so Helen learned several different ways to read. Her mother learned some of it and taught Helen. And then Helen, through reading these magazines, learned to read much better.
Let me stop you for a second because I think it's important that listeners understand, Braille was developed by Louis Braille in 1824, but it was quite a while before Braille itself was adopted. And one of the things that a lot of schools and people did early on, if you will, was assume that blind students could learn to feel raised regular characters. And then when they discovered that wasn't working as well as it could, other kind of languages were developed. As Peggy said, New York Point, and I said moon type.
Hmm.
which are two different languages, if you will, of raised characters that are somewhat different from Braille. And it was a while before people realized finally that there were advantages to what Braille offered because it was a very simple, in a sense, dot configuration, but people could learn to read it and learn to read it well and read fast with it.
New York Point was 2 dots high and 4 dots wide.
Right.
And the New York Point was started in New York, of course, with the schools there. The Perkins School for the Blind, which began in the 1830s, used the raised print system. They had their own printing press and everything. So they had all of the equipment to print their own books. Therefore, they were invested in more ways than one into that raised system. The first school that actually taught Braille in this country was the Missouri School for the
Mm-hmm.
Blind in 1860. Um, so Braille didn't quite catch on here. New York Point had caught on and had spread across, especially New England and the East Coast, far more than
And Braille.
the Braille did,
Mm-hmm.
which is why the Matilda Ziegler magazine was in Braille. Um, some of the religious magazines were Matilda Ziegler, I'm sorry, was in New York Point at first before it went into Braille. So um,
Why do you
Helen
think
would,
Braille finally caught on?
well, it had a lot to do with money, but it also had to do with the fact that, the schools for the blind up until probably about the 1860s did more lecture and question and answer. And that's how you learn. They didn't have either the money or the printing press or the access to actual tactile books for the kids. So the teachers themselves would lecture and they would memorize and recite a lot more than the sighted children did in the schools. Although my dad tells stories about how they didn't have a lot of school books either in his school when he was growing up. So I don't know, maybe that wasn't so different. But when Helen was reading things, she was getting some magazines from France because Europe, England had publications in Braille, and they could be received here in the United States. So her mother signed her up for those, signed her up for newsletters coming out of California. California was quite a literate state in that the School for the Blind, um, the school in Berkeley, the Institute for the Blind, they all had printing presses so that they could manufacture their books and share them. So Ohio was another place that her mother got her books, Helen's books, from as well. So she got all this material and encouraged Helen to read and read and read. And she also taught Helen to type at the age of 6 because her mother knew how to type. So her mother taught her how to type. Again, it was kind of a game. The keyboard was a game. And she learned to type quite well. So she kept a diary in print and she wrote articles. Her mother would read to her. And they developed at first their own sign language, and then her mother and her sister learned sign language and they would spell into Helen's hand.
Mm-hmm.
Now, her dad died when she was about 20. Her sister was about 12 at the time. And so the mother had to go back to work. She became a seamstress. She had her own shop. She sewed dresses for people in town, and Helen learned how to do that. Helen had learned how to cook. She was constantly by her mother's side. So when her mother went to work, she was in charge of the house. Her mother got her classes at conservatories of music. Her mother went with her and translated into Helen's hand what was being said for the class. She never graduated from a conservatory, but because of her exposure, people were like, this, she's deaf and she's blind and she's playing the piano. This is so amazing. She plays it with feeling. And so she would get a little concert here and a little concert there, and pretty soon it expanded. And her mother thought, well, let's see where it goes, you know? So she started promoting her daughter, getting her all these concerts. There were all these professionals, musicians, educators, even from the schools for the blind, who would come and watch Helen perform because they just couldn't believe a deafblind person could do this. And when Helen would travel, she had the same experience. Her mother would send ahead all this information about Helen Mae Martin, the deafblind piano uh, pianist who was going to perform. And there would be the announcement in the paper, but many times the reporters didn't believe that Helen was deafblind. So they didn't put the article in. They would wait till after the performance, and then there would be the article about Helen Mae Martin. And I went to see her, and she really is deaf, and she really is blind, and she plays beautifully. Ripley's Believe It or Not had a program on the radio. He also had a Ripley's Believe It or Not theater in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And he sent someone out to check out Helen and see if she really was a deafblind pianist, and discovered that she was. And he brought her on her show. She was well received in New York and got a multi-week contract to perform at his Believe It or Not theater in New York. So she was in New York for quite a while, several months, performing for many concerts and many theaters in New York. Helen died in 1947, so she was like about 52 years old. So she wasn't really that old. And her sister died in 1939, who was much younger than she was. So Mrs. Martin ended up outliving all of her children.
Mm.
Neither of Helen or her sister ever married or had children. So her mother ended up not in poverty, but she certainly was not a wealthy woman when she passed away. But before she passed away, she supposedly gave all of Helen's diaries to some historical society of which no one can find, which I'm hoping they're in a back box behind the furnace somewhere, and someday they'll be unearthed. Because that would be fascinating. The little bits of her journal that were recorded in newspapers. She wrote very well. She had a very strong vocabulary. Some people equate deaf people with having a smaller vocabulary. That was certainly not the case with Helen.
Mm-mm.
And Helen has been somebody that has really touched a lot of people. When you think about what you can and cannot do, nobody told Helen she couldn't. Nobody said, you know, as a deaf person, probably the piano is not something you should try to take up. But encouraged her because she had an interest and worked with Helen's interests and worked with what Helen knew. And her mother did that and encouraged her, made sure she was literate because she was a lot older when she went to school, really, when she went to school. She took about 5 years to complete the academic courses at the School for the Blind. And she did get a certificate of graduation. She was older than the rest of the students. Her mother had blind pianists come and work with Helen while Helen was growing up. So she had, you know, music teachers, and she found some deaf students, graduates from the schools for the deaf from other states, sometimes Kansas, who would come and work with the family. That's how they learned sign languages. So Helen's mother was extremely important with making Helen who she was.
I wonder if she ever met Helen Keller.
Yes, she did. They both met when they were adults.
Mm-hmm.
Helen Mae Martin had written to Helen Keller, and Helen Keller had heard about the blind woman who was the pianist, the blind and deaf woman. So when Helen Keller uh, went on one of her tours, she went to Nebraska. And Helen and her mother went and stayed with a relative and got an audience with Helen Keller. Of course, Helen Keller was always followed by reporters.
Hmm.
And so they reported on the meeting of the two Helens, and they called Helen May Martin the second Helen Keller. Well, Helen Keller was not happy with that. She said, "Are you kidding? She is not the second Helen Keller. She has far exceeded everything I could have ever done.
I can see
She
her
is
saying
a,"
that.
yes, she was just, it was really wonderful. She scolded the reporter. And that reporter didn't report on the scolding, but another reporter reported on Helen Keller scolding the reporter for saying that she was the second Helen Keller. And don't you call her the second Helen Keller.
Yeah. It's interesting that you clearly worked at this pretty hard and found a lot of information about her even so. And you're right. It would be nice to find her journals and the other things. And I bet you will at some point. They're somewhere.
I think so. I think there's somewhere.
Now, I have to go back to a story that you talked about a little bit on our first Unstoppable Mindset episode, because you said something here that brought it up, and that is that Helen May Martin learned to type. Tell us about the history of the typewriter, will you?
Oh, I love to. As
I know it's a great story.
when I go to talk to um, the students who are at agencies for the blind learning to be blind people, when they're in their adjustment to blindness training, a lot of them, oh, talk about how difficult the computer is because it's so difficult you can't see the keys. And I love to tell the story of the invention of the typewriter because it was an invention for blind people. And we have forgotten that as a society. The typewriter was the invention of a man who was overly friendly with this countess, married to this count. The count wasn't attentive enough for the countess, so she had to find other interests.
Friends.
But they would write back and forth. Now, the problem was the ladies in waiting who wrote the letters to her friend, her special friend, showed them to the count. And that just, wasn't a good thing. So,
Yeah.
and they also didn't get delivered either because if the count didn't like it, he had the letter destroyed. So he invented this device where she could type out the letters and then send them to him without having a lady's maid between them. And it caught on. The schools for the blind in New York, especially the schools for the blind, taught typing at the school. And their students by the late 1880s and early 1890s were going to state fairs and the World's Fair, demonstrating the typewriter for the Remington Company as something that really would help the gentlemen who were secretaries in the office. Lady secretaries were not quite yet the thing. And
Would have helped Bob Cratchit. Anyway, go ahead.
you never know, do you? Um,
Humbug.
I love that story.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, so their students graduated, were really good typists, and they saw to them that they got put into insurance companies, law firms, and highlighted their students as typists. And the typewriter was also catching on really well in the business community because now you didn't have to decipher some of that handwriting. And believe me, that handwriting that still exists from back then is very difficult always to
It's
figure
not
out.
just handwriting of old days or days of yore that is hard to understand, so I'm told.
No, it's today's, but yes. Well, and they're actually teaching handwriting again in school. A little side note is that I have a lot of volunteers that have been transcribing documents for me from about 1915 to about 1980 from the collection of old files at the Colorado Center for the Blind that we unearthed. And we found we could not use high school students and some younger college students because they couldn't read handwriting.
Oof.
So we had to go into the retirement communities to find our volunteers, who are very good, by the way. But anyway, so the typewriter has was really the communication material tool that was used by so many blind people for a long time, and I think we got away from that now, where we have to have special keyboards for the blind. Some places are really insistent on that. Some blind people are insistent on
Yeah.
that. When you were meant not to look at the keys. That's why the two little bumps on the
Hmm.
F and the H are there, is so that you could orient yourself and continue typing, looking at the paper. The sighted ladies would look at the paper and type their material, and not have to look at their keys. So something that we have forgotten, and like the scanner is, a product that was originally designed for blind people. Um, we've forgotten that, I think, in our society as well. But I like the inventions that blind people have contributed, such as cruise control.
Hmm.
That was an invention by a blind man to make the cars in his lot stand out from the other car dealers in his small town. Um, there was a man in Minnesota who had lost his hand as well as his eyesight and part of his hearing. He went to the summer programs for adult blind people at the School for the Blind in the uh, late 20s, early 30s. Um, there were no programs for adult blind in the state really at that point, unless you wanted to make brooms. They suggested that he become a piano tuner, and he said, "Well, you know, I really wasn't very musical when I had my sight and my hearing. I don't really see how I can be a piano tuner if I can't hear it, and I only have one hand." So, what he got out of those summer programs, though, was he met other blind people who gave him job leads, and they told him to go to this broom factory in Minneapolis because it was owned by a blind guy, and he employed some blind guys and sighted guys as well. So he went up there, and this is during the Depression, and the guy said, "I really love to help you. I don't need anybody in the factory. I have all the blind salesmen. Most of his salesmen were blind. I have all the salesmen that I can use for this area. But, if you want to branch out and head out to, like, say, North Dakota or South Dakota, I'd be glad to hire you." And probably thought he'd never heard from the guy again. But the guy came back and says, "Well, I found another guy. He doesn't have a job, he doesn't have a home, but he's got a pickup." So the two of them bought as many brooms as they could put into the pickup, and they headed out, sold all the brooms. They came back. The two men, in a couple of years, earned enough money where they both bought property. And this guy, he bought the property and what we would call today flipped it.
Hmm.
Bought a duplex and got renters in it, continued to sell brooms until he really became pretty handy at flipping houses, buying and selling property. So he got kind of tired though, because, he's now like close to 50 years old, and he has to change the storm windows on the house in Minnesota. Have to put on the screens in the summer and the storms in the winter. And he's climbing up the ladder. He's only got one hand trying to change the windows on the second story, and thought, there has got to be a better way to do this. I really don't want to keep climbing up this ladder. So he talked to this other guy, a blind guy who was a furniture builder, had his own furniture shop. And he told the guy, "This is my idea. I want to design a window where it comes in on a hinge, and then I can just reach in, pull in the storm, clean it, put it back." And they invented this window. He built a few of them on his own, demonstrated that it worked, put it in his house. This window company came along, bought the patent, and the blind guy never worked again. He didn't have to work again. Um, the neat thing, though, was when he went blind, uh, his wife had passed away a couple of years before, and he became very depressed, lost his job, lost his house that he had paid for. His relatives and the county came and took his three children away. When he sold his patent, he got two of his children back. His oldest child was now in the service and serving in World War II. But he got his children back. He provided a home for his mother. He actually remarried again. You know, a man who just came back from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And then out of his own need created this window that many houses in the Midwest, the older houses built in the late 40s and 50s, have those windows that you pull in on a hinge and open up, and they clean them and close
Put
them
them
back
back
up.
out. Now, of
Yeah.
course, we have dual pane windows and other things like that. But yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
So who invented the scanner?
Well, that was Ray Kurzweil.
I just wanted to see if you'd say that.
Yeah.
It's
Ray,
interesting. Yeah, go
Ray
ahead.
Kurzweil's an interesting guy. He is still alive
He
and
is.
still very concerned about blind people and active in the blind community, providing funds for scholarships and so on.
We
But he,
correspond.
yeah, and he had this wonderful idea in the 70s to provide a scanner that would read to the blind. And it was this huge, I mean, it was bigger than my washing machine.
Yeah, the whole thing weighed 400 pounds.
Oh
Not too
my
bad.
gosh. Yeah, the public library in Minneapolis bought one.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, not a lot of people used it because they locked it up because they were afraid it was going to get broken.
That makes sense somehow. Yeah, right. It's interesting though also to try to describe how the scanner worked because you can't really say it took a picture like you would do today with a phone
No.
because the way it worked was there was a piece of technology called a charge couple device. Won't go into the theory of that, but basically the scanner would move up and down the page like an inch at a time, scanning across, then dropping down, scanning back, dropping down, and so on, building up an image that took almost a minute to do. And then the computer would take probably anywhere from, depending on the complexity, 20 seconds to 30 or 45 seconds to process it. And then it would read out loud. But it worked.
And you had access to that book right
And you had
away.
access to that book right away. And it worked. And of course, it did get better over time. And then Ray was also very much involved in unlimited vocabulary voice input
Hmm.
and other things. So, you mentioned two blind senators. Were there any other blind national politicians?
There were five blind congressmen altogether. There was Thomas Shaw, and there was Matthew Dunn. He served from 1935 to 1940. He was the last of any of our national representatives as blind people. And Matthew Dunn came from Pennsylvania. He was an interesting person because he was interested in politics, but it was not what he wanted as a career. But he did it because he was a part of the Pennsylvania Association for the Blind, which was one of the original affiliates of the National Federation of the Blind. They were very concerned that the welfare system in the country was going federal, which was a good thing and a bad thing. A good
Mm-hmm.
thing if it was done right, a bad thing if it was not. And they knew from just Pennsylvania alone how a charity system, a welfare system, a poorhouse system, they had all these different types of programs to serve blind people as far as financial was concerned. And they had many situations in their state where if you lived on one side of the street as a blind person, you could get maybe $8 a month. If you lived on the other side, maybe only two because you crossed a county line or you crossed out of the city.
Hmm.
And so they wanted to have some input on a federal level to all this um, op these pieces of legislation, Social Security, the rehabilitation legislation that was being bandied about. They wanted to have some input into it to make sure that it wasn't a charity, that it wasn't for the poor, that it was something that would make you have a step up, that you could get out of poverty, that you wouldn't be stuck there, that you would have an opportunity to get a job, that you would have an opportunity to go to school and still get some financial support, that you could own your own home and maybe still get some financial support. Because if you were a blind person in Pennsylvania, in some parts of the state, and you went blind at, say, 40 years old, your house was paid for, you had to sell that house or that asset in order to get financial
Hmm.
support. And they wanted people to have a right to protect what they have so they can get a step up and get back to work. And Matthew Dunn was sent there by the blind people, and he campaigned on those issues about wanting to go to Washington to make sure that the new laws regarding Social Security, rehabilitation, would provide people an opportunity to progress rather than stay at home, remain in poor farms,
Hmm.
remain in nursing homes. So he was an interesting sort.
And it's a
Now,
battle that still goes on today.
for you know, as much as we look at history, if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it, and you just look at things and they just cycle through and cycle
Hmm.
through. I remember in the 1920 minutes of the NFB of Minnesota, back then it was called the Minnesota State Organization of the Blind, there were three resolutions that were just about the same as three of the resolutions at the 1995 convention. It's like, we haven't gone very far, have we?
Not in some ways. We have been doing this mostly an hour, but I can't end this without saying two things. One, we'll have to do another one.
Oh, sounds good.
But but the other one is tell me a little bit about your recent trip to Washington. That had to be fascinating.
It was fascinating. I went to Washington knowing very little. What I thought I knew turned out not to be what I should have known. Um, I came across a newspaper article about, 4 years, 5 years ago, 5 years ago, I guess now, about a blind guy, a broom maker, who had gotten an award from the Harmon Foundation. And I couldn't understand why he got the award because it didn't really say why he got the award. He just got an award. Well, I didn't find out much about the broom maker. So I decided to look in the Harmon Foundation. And what I had learned online was that the Harmon Foundation had um, given a lot of support, financial awards, loans, to the Black community who were into art. And I couldn't figure out how this broom maker, this white guy broom maker, fit in. And there was nothing online about it until I got into the Library of Congress and found the Harmon Foundation collection. And I looked at that and went, oh my gosh, there must be a lot of data there. Because the Harmon Foundation collection goes from 1913 to 1965. There's 122 boxes. 14 of them are for this one program. Now, there's about, maybe 20, 30, 40 programs that the Harmon Foundation also has in this collection. None of them have that many boxes connected with it.
Mm.
So I thought I had hit a gold mine. And in a way, I did, just not what I anticipated. The first 2 days, I spent 11 days in the Library of Congress. The first 2 days, I took the, the boxes chronologically and could not figure out what the heck was going on because none of it made sense. None of it fit into the stuff I knew about the program, and the strangest stuff were coming up. People were writing on behalf of a school for the blind or a public school area wanting a playground for the school for the blind. And I'm thinking now, in a literary award program, why would you write and ask that? And then there were all these letters from blind people wanting to go to college and asking for a loan. And again, I thought, what, that just doesn't fit. So it took me till the third day before I got an understanding of exactly what was going on. The Harmon Foundation, William Harmon was the chair. He decided in 1927 he wanted a new program that would provide awards to blind people, much like the literary program that was providing scholarships for college students. They had a essay contest for farmers down in the South, and they would award them money to beautify their property. They also had this program, once I saw their newsletters, where they had provided within like a 5-year period over 50 playgrounds to schools or communities for children. And so it's starting to dawn on me that there's this group of people who've done their research on the Harmon Foundation, and there's a group of people that haven't done their research, and then there's what's going on with the award. The Harmon Foundation knew they had to reach out to the blind community. Part of their structure when they were doing new awards, and they did many, was to reach out and put an advisory committee together with someone from the Harmon Foundation and those in that community in which they were trying to enhance. So they wanted to reach out to the blind community. They found the Matilda Ziegler magazine, and they had the editor as one of their advisory committees, and they reached out to the American Foundation for the Blind and ended up with a few of their representatives on that advisory committee. Their normal process, the Harmon Foundation's normal process, was then to take this advisory committee and then reach down into the community and have all these nominators who would take the applications for the awards and seek out applicants, get the applications filled out, get the supporting documents filled out. For example, in their farm and land beautification one, photographs needed to be taken sometimes, or they needed to get the names of some of the plants they were using. Sometimes fruits and vegetables were sent to the Harmon Foundation to show, hey, look how good my garden went, that kind of thing. So the nominators were to make sure that all of that was completed before the application was then sent in. That didn't work. The application process, the Harmon Foundation put the application together, much like their other programs, and sent it to the advisory committee. And there were about 12 different versions of it after it went to the advisory committee. In the Harmon Foundation original version, that they had asked for awards. They were going to give out 100 awards in total, and there were about 8 categories. And they were going to have an award for the person who submits this great work of literary work. They were going to have an award for people who wrote essays about how they have made a difference in their life, how they made a difference in other people's lives as blind people. And especially in that one, there's a little subnote, and it says when it's talking about what you might include in the essay, which is usually only about a paragraph, it mentioned and talk about how as you progressed your posture got better or
Mm.
you became more involved in the community. Well, the advisory committee ended up pulling all of that out. So the final application had a page of, is this person neat? Is this person polite? Uh, what is the posture of this person? All these personal things that when the blind people who were reading the Matilda Ziegler magazine, because Matilda Ziegler put all this information about the awards, they did a lot of promotion about the awards. They sent in essays from uh, their previous editions of their Matilda magazine to the Harmon Foundation to say these are the kind of essays that blind people can write, and they can tell you about how they have made a difference in their lives. They've made a success of this career. They have been instrumental in building their community school or their community church. Um, but the Matilda Ziegler magazine people got the application and filled out what they thought was important, the references and so on, and they get to all this stuff about their personal behavior. And one lady writes in and says, I'm submitting my essay, but I'm not going to fill out these pieces because I don't think it has any bearing on whether or not my essay
Yeah.
uh, sh- should be judged on that
Should be
qualification.
judged.
So I'm I'm getting the drift here that the people that were sending in essays were not completing their application. The deadline, the applications were sent out on April 15th of 1928. The deadline was August 15th of 1928. AFB provided a list of all of the organizations, the mailing list of all the names, organizations, schools, workshops for the blind. And the Harmon Foundation sent out letters asking all of these agency people to be the nominators. The AFB did not do that. They didn't write separate cover. Hey, we're participating in this Harmon Foundation Award and we want you to support this award, be a nominator, and we want you to help fill out these applications and send them back. So these principals at the schools for the blind or in the public schools who oversaw the program for public schools or the director of a workshop, they they would either totally ignore it or they would write back, well, sure, I'll be a nominator. I don't know what it involves, but you can use my name. So come August 15th, the Harmon Foundation doesn't have enough
Hmm.
accepted applications to fill the awards. So they're contacting AFB and Matilda Ziegler. What do we do? Um, they extend the award for children and for been blind for 2 years. How have you progressed in 2 years to November 1st? They still don't get enough because what happened is, especially with a lot of these schools, they saw it as a charity award, not a literary award. And so they would send the application in, partially filled out, and say, this student deserves this award because they came to the school and they only had one set of clothing and we have been needing to support this student. Or you need to give this student an award because they're an orphan.
The
There's no
AFB didn't really
essay.
do a lot of service to help this project along, well, did they?
No, it
Yeah.
did not. It did not.
Which is
And
something that
that
we find fairly typical, but anyway.
But I think the Harmon Foundation figured that out by the end of the summer of
Hmm.
2028. And then Harmon dies. And so the foundation is kind of put into a little bit of a tizzy. What are they going to do? Um, they decide to carry on the Blind Award only because it was one of William Harmon's real last enthusiasm, excitement for something he was excited about.
Hmm.
So they they start to reach out to people, or they reach out to the people whose applications they had rejected because they weren't filled out properly, or they didn't have the references and so on, and try to get these applications filled out. So they set a deadline of like the fall of 1929, and they still don't have enough, and they're still pulling teeth. And now they're writing, back to Thomas Shaw again, they're writing to the heads of the Minneapolis and the St. Paul public school systems that have programs for the blind, whose names they have, saying, "Hi, would you mind sending in an application for this Harmon Award for Thomas Shaw? Can you fill this out and send it back to us?" And they get the letters back saying, "Well, he's not a student here. Yes, we know who he is, but, he's not involved with our school. So, you know, thank you very much."
Yeah.
So there's no interest in it. Um, and what I'm finding, I've got a lot more of checking and rechecking and figuring out and who sent in what references and so on. But one thing that has kind of stood out to me already is that there's a woman I've written about before. Her name is Emma Mast, and she was a coffee taster for Schilling Company and purported to be the best coffee taster in the United States for 25 years. Um, and the coffee business does not dispute that. She was nominated by her sister. August Schilling, who owned the company, wrote this glowing reference letter and sent in their Schilling promotional book that highlights her in it, for about 2 or 3 pages. And Schilling owns, I mean, they have a lot of things, not just coffee, spices and everything. But she got a couple of pages in this book, and no other staff person did. Her direct supervisor did. Some community people wrote in letters of reference. Her sister dotted all the I's, crossed all the T's, and Emma didn't get an award. But I'm finding this other lady from Washington State who went blind later in life, in her early 30s. She was a teacher and she did a little tutoring on the side, but she learned to make rugs and baskets and decorated her house. And so she gets an award. But I think her references came mostly from the blindness system. So I'm really interested to dive into this more and see the people who got the awards. Were they coming from the blindness system, where the blindness system people were supporting them, and the awards that the applications from blind people or for blind people that weren't necessarily involved in the blindness system, were they the ones that got nicked? I'm going to find that very interesting. I've run across some really interesting letters already in this collection that make me stop and go, "Oh my gosh."
Well, we are going to have to do another episode to find out what happens with that, to find out other things that you did in Washington and other things that are going on with all of the studies that you have. We've actually gone well over an hour.
Yeah, we have.
That's
Oh
okay.
well.
That's okay. But I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank you all
Thank
for
you.
listening to us. This has been great. I hope you enjoyed it.
And
How do
if you want to get on my
I
email
was just
list,
going to ask you, how do people, I wouldn't do that to you. So tell people how they can reach out to you, learn more from you, and get on your email list, please.
just shoot me an email to the blind history lady. That's all one word, the blind history lady at gmail.com, and I will be glad to add you to my monthly email list.
And I
There
will
is
tell
no
you,
subscription fee.
and I will tell you that she does respond if you ask a question, because she responded to me. Well, I hope you enjoyed this, everyone. Reach out to the blind history lady at gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from you. Love to hear your thoughts about today. Please email me at michaelhi@accessibe.com, michaelhi at accessibecom, or go to our podcast page, www.michaelhingson.com/podcast, michaelhingson. What I would ask is, wherever you're listening, we would really appreciate it if you give us a 5-star rating. We value very highly your ratings and love those 5-star ones. Love to hear your input, your thoughts. Please review this podcast. And for all of you, and Peggy, you as well, if you know of anyone else who we ought to have as a guest on Unstoppable Mindset, please introduce us. We love it. So once again, Peggy, I want to thank you for being here. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. It has.